Well, welcome to the Saplings Conference on the book of James, and we're going to be just looking at it topically, not necessarily verse by verse. In a book like James, a lot of the same stuff is going to be covered more than once as far as the verses and what he's trying to teach us. But we're going to go through a series of questions trying to understand what the book of James has for us. And if this is your first time with us, thank you for tuning in. Tree of Life Ministries is a ministry that reaches out to teach people a better way to live. And it comes from Isaiah 61:3, where it says that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Christ, and by extension of us, that we can be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. And this idea of saplings is that we're growing up into Christ, to the fullness of what he can do for us and what we can be through him. The last conference that we had was in person at New Covenant Church, and we looked at the idea of root rot and how we don't examine ourselves and that we don't grow well because of that, and we don't reach our potential of who we can be in Christ. All of those videos are here on Facebook. If you'd like to find those, just scroll down or look on the videos tab, and they're also on YouTube on our channel there. So we'd just love for you to be able to go back and look at that. But as I mentioned, we're going to be spending a lot of time today in the book of James. And the 6 questions that we're going to look at is, first, how does James understand God? How do we see trials and temptations? How does James call us to consistency? How do we see faith and works? What is wisdom? And how does the Word of God work in our lives? And we're going to start with that first question. How does James understand God? For this is the supreme question. And however you get there, whether you're an atheist who doesn't believe in God, but you're trying to come up with reasons to not believe in God, whether you're an agnostic who says there might be a God or there might not be a God, whether you're a theist, that you say there's a God, but that's all you're willing to say, or you're a Christian who definitely has a doctrine or an idea, a formulation of who and what God is. It doesn't matter. Your understanding of God is the greatest question that you can think about. Everything else in your life flows from that. Again, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, everything flows from who you think God is and what he does. Now, for us as Christians, the teaching of Christ and the thought that he held and who he is takes priority. In fact, it's the axle on which everything else as Christians revolves around. Who Christ is and what he says about himself and what he says about God. And everything that we think, everything that we believe, all of our doctrines, all of our moral and ethic conduct comes out of who Christ says he is, what he does, and what he said about God. Now, take away what this understanding of the commandments that Christ gave and the ethics and the moral teachings of the New Testament, and it all becomes valueless. It all becomes meaningless. And it doesn't matter what kind of eschatological framework you want to say and talk about the rapture or the not rapture or mid-trib or post-trib or pre-trib. All of those things are meaningless without the idea that there's a commandment, an ethic, a moral way of living. And it says there in Matthew 23:37 that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. The love which Christ sets forth here is the pivot. Again, that idea of axle, of everything turning around it. This thought is the pivot point, the place where everything else moves around. Now, the Lord doesn't enforce it in the sense that you have to. The human nature can't be forced in that sense, because it's the human heart is free. He's created us to be free. The commandment to love, though, is not unreasonable in the sense that we say things like Christ saved me, or he's delivered me, or he did this, or he did that, or I love him because of the sweetness of his presence or whatever. So the idea of the commandment to love is not unreasonable. In fact, when we're taught to pray the Our Father who art in heaven, or we read through the New Testament, we find that we're taught to see God as the fountain of all being, the author of all light, that he's the root of all joy, he's the capacity of all knowledge, that he's the one that everything else flows from. And so we find our rest and our hope and our love in him and through him. In fact, what does the psalmist say in 73? He says, whom do I have in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. When we realize this fundamental relationship between the soul and God, we see how natural it is for that command to take place, that we're to love God with our whole heart, our whole mind, our whole soul. So again, it's not vanity, it's not without some great importance that we ask the question, what are your thoughts about God? If God is a far-off sovereign, a far-off deity that only wound up the world and then lets it run, you're going to have one view of the thought of what it means to love God. If you say that God is this judge and who is keeping score and is waiting for you to fail, you're going to have specific ways that you're going to relate to God. If you're going to see that God is joyous and active and wise and a just being who is actively involved in our lives and in the world around us, that he loves us and he is doing good things, then you're going to see God in an entirely different way. So we come back to the idea of, what does James say God's thoughts are? Well, James' thoughts about God kind of revolve around three different groups. And the first is that God is light, the second is God is righteous, and the third is God is love. Now, we don't find those statements in so many words, but we can find in the general drift of James' theory, James' teaching, the way that he groups certain thoughts together, the way that he appeals to us to act a certain way or to believe a certain way or to speak a certain way. We can see how James comes back to this idea that God is light, God is righteous, and God is love. He does not say, like John does in 1 John 1:5, that God is light, but he does say this remarkable thing in verse 17 of the first chapter. He says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. God is the Father of lights himself, a light who knows no change and where no shadows fall. The shadows which come across our pathway and which obscure our minds or cause doubt or anxiety in us arise from the world around us. They don't come from God, and that's not where God would have us to be. And it is true, and I don't want to discount, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about what James says about trials and temptations. We don't want to make light of the realness of the trouble that goes on around us. And some of that trouble we can understand. We can understand how that suffering can and evil can pervert good, or the discipline of hardship strengthens and consolidates character. There's times, though, where it seems God tolerates evil, or that the laws of the world favor the bad. But the faith of James, and I hope the faith that you have, lifts us up above that plane of thought. He believes that in the presence of God there dwells a light in which all things are absorbed, or rather that they can be transported to the platform of heaven, where every shadow cast by the unstable things in this world disappear. The shadows are here where we are. In the center of all things, on the throne of which God sits, though, there are no shadows. In other words, Jesus teaches what John teaches, that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. Now, I read that passage in John, I read this passage in James, and I sometimes wonder that it's more speculative than it is practical. Oh, God sits in a place of light. Whoopee, right? That so what that God sits in a place where there is no darkness. It's free from shadow, that evil doesn't touch there at all. It seems to me that that place is so far removed from us that it is inaccessible to us. It's inaccessible to any creature who is bound by time and space, that we're doomed to live here in an ever-shifting, ever-lengthening, sometimes it feels like, shadows, and that we can't get past them. But to think thus is to forget the form in which James has put his thoughts. To him, God is light, and from his presence all darkness is banished. He does not suggest this arid truth as a truth of comfort or a ground of comfort. He's clearly trying to make us realize and rest upon the character of God. He's dealing with the case of the man who's inclined to throw all of his failures, all of the problems in his life, everything that he could list that he would find distasteful, and say, God is the one that did that. But James, a few verses before 17, says, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. What he's trying to get us to see is that we need to investigate our own nature and search in our own nature for the causes of our failure, because we won't find those in God. That God, by his very nature, can only give forth good and can only be good. Now, the good that God gives us, we can misuse, we can abuse, we can do all the things that are less than good with all the blessings that God's given us. But it's still the simple fact that God is pure, he is brilliant, he is beautiful, and everything that shines out of him is a gift. The sun, the stars, the moon, the air, the food, everything about us. Even the things that we manipulate, like microwaves or cell phones or computers, that in and of themselves, they are good. At worst, they're amoral, that they don't have any good or bad about them, that we, out of our own nature, are what make them good or bad. So when he talks about God is light, and that we can go to a place to where he is and be in that light, he's not talking about the greatness of God, and he's not talking about our security of salvation or our security of hope or our security of mercy being in the greatness of God. He's talking about that the goodness of our salvation, the hope of our mercy, the blessing that we have around us is in the character of God. We can rest assured and be secure because he is what he is. He is very good in his nature. And it is inconceivable that it's inconceivable that God would put forth anything that is evil to man. The light in which he dwells is no mere dazzling splendor. The light is the light of goodness. It's the light of truth. It's the light of right. It's the light of justice. So this fundamental ethic of existence is guaranteed by the Father of light. That's why he uses that phrase. And James wishes us to see and to be assured, and even be more than assured, in the sense that we know that we have $5 in our pocket and we don't have to look. He wants more than that kind of assurance. He wants you to step forward into that. God is going to have the experiences of your life be good if you will just invite God into those. Which takes us to our next one, is that he is essentially good. Therefore, it follows that he's essentially righteous. When we speak of God's righteousness, we are thinking of the application of goodness to the conditions of the world in which we live. Let us think about how James takes a hold of this idea, because it's very easy to look in the world in which we live in, that the evil keeps getting worse. The wicked man seems to be the one holding all the power, authority, and wealth. But James has been called the last of the prophets. And by that, what all the authors that I read that use that want us to get this idea that he takes the thoughts of the prophets like Isaiah and Amos and kind of updates them, if you will, or takes them and makes them very practical. And James is saturated, just like Isaiah and Amos were, that God is righteous. Because God is righteous and he wants us to be righteous, he phrases these things in very specific ways. It says, let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of let me start over. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. To fail in one point is to fail in them all. To be angry is to be exactly the opposite of the righteousness of God. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point is guilty of all of the law. See, when we talk about God's righteousness, sometimes we want to point out a specific part of it, and we want to talk about he's righteous to heal, he's righteous to save, or he's righteous to do this act, or he's righteous because he does that act. And we sometimes miss that God can't help but be righteous in all that he does. Now, we pinpoint things because we're preaching it or because we're asking a specific thing or we want a specific thing. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. What I'm saying, though, is don't lose the forest for the trees. The heavenly wisdom that God gives us, the righteousness that God displays, the goodness that he shines forth is in everything that he does. It's everything about him. He can't help but be righteous. And he wants us to be the exact same way. And James keeps coming back to this idea over and over in his letter. He says that wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. We are righteous because we live peaceful lives. We are righteous when we reflect God's righteousness, that we love all men, that we're good to all men, that we don't play favorites, that no matter where we find ourselves in, we learn to be content, that we're patient. This idea of showing all and treating all the same finds a lot of ground in James's letter, because he wants us to really think about whether if we're poor, how we relate to the rich, envy, greedy thoughts, that we don't want to be that way. And if we are a place where we are a little bit more well off, that we don't look down on those who are around us. Remember in James 5:10, and we'll look at this later again, the judge standeth at the door. If he's going to be righteous and we're going to stand before him and give an account, why wait till that moment to be righteous and plead the blood of Christ, which we will all do. But if we're going to plead the blood of Christ then, let's plead the blood of Christ now and become peaceable and impartial and patient and good and righteous. There's no explicit statement of truth in James that God is love. And we might be able to at first think that James doesn't even deal with God's love. But I think that as I've meditated on this and thought about this and read about it and read the book of James and read about it some more, we first need to understand what we mean by love. The New Testament does not give us and want us to think of love in some sentimental way. It's not some kind of flabby fondness. Love in the New Testament is some kind of urgent and earnest force. It never lowers itself in just for the sake of winning or the sake of manipulating the objects that it wants to have love it. It is a spirit that seeks only and can only seek the real and abiding good of those it loves. Therefore, it can come in a somewhat severe form. I'll never forget early in my Christian life, I had an author that said that getting caught talking about our sin is sometimes the severest form of grace. And I've had that play out in my life, but that idea of God allowing us to be found out in our sin or sin to overcome us being a severe grace. Well, God, why did you let me go bankrupt? Well, perhaps that drew you to him. Lord, why did you let that happen or this happen? Well, you were sinning, and God let you have the course of the sin so that you would come back to him, so that your relationship, not only him, would be restored, perhaps family members or your business or whatever it is. This idea of love coming in a very severe form, not because it wants to punish, but because it wants to draw, is something that we really need to think about. You know, nothing can separate us from God's love. I mean, that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. But the love of God can burn like fire. Isn't that what Hebrews says? God is a blaze of fire. Doesn't it say in 1 Corinthians 3:13 that there's going to be a fire one day that's going to try every man's sort of work for what it is? That makes us think about love and this idea of being consuming, and that it's going to burn away the dross, burn away the straw, the wood, the stubble, is what he says there in Corinthians. And what does he say in John? Is that we love the idea of God is love, but what also does he say? That God is light and in him is no darkness at all. So if we say we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not have the truth. So the love is, as John hears it and sees it, is a purifying force as well. So then practical love, the idea that we not only say we love, but that it has definite action within us, is something that we really need to understand. I look around and I see the world around us, and I see so many Christians who would stand for truth, and that is great, and that's wonderful. But because they're standing for truth, they are not standing in love. They're not being very practical with that truth. So James comes to us and has a stern statement there in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. He says, "Pure religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unspotted from this world." James would say, do you not see the righteousness of God, that God is love, and it manifests himself in him wanting you to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves, the fatherless. We just had Father's Day a couple of weeks ago, and I challenged the men at our church to think about being fathers, not just to their biological children, but I was blessed to have a man come into my life when I was in my 20s who wanted to be my dad, in the sense that he showed me what it was like to be married. He told me stories of his failures. He told me stories of his victory. We sat around and drank lots of coffee and just did life together. It wasn't about money that he gave. It was more about time and more about love and more about prayer. And then, in my particular case, help me be a better minister. This idea of helping the orphan, the fatherless. The same way with the widows. What about the aged? Just put them in a nursing home. Just get rid of them and forget about them. That seems to be the way that the world wants to deal with those who are elderly. And yet James would say, how can you say you love God? How can you say you believe God is righteous? How can you say you believe God is just? And yet you push out things in your life that would be inconvenient. Doesn't that make you unjust? Doesn't that make you unrighteous? He goes on to talk about how we talk about people. In chapter 3, verse 9, he says, we bless the Lord and Father with our mouths, and we curse God, and we curse people. He talks about that we can't have spring water and salt water flowing out of the same place. This idea of God is love. We say we love God again, and then when God comes to us to love and we're in that relationship, it doesn't seem like it affects the people around us very much. The man with a greedy or avarice temperament sees everything through the medium of his own covetousness. He cannot see things in their true proportion. They take distorted shapes. The most beautiful things can be deformed to a man who is covetous. He sees the human figure misshapen, like he was in that one of those hollow house of mirrors that you have at the carnival or at the circus. View life through God, through his righteousness, through his justice, through his love, and all of a sudden, man's shape takes different proportions. We don't see humanity as a freak anymore. We don't see life as a delusion. We don't see temptation as a snare. Let us see God and let us see our lives in God, and then we can see the purpose for which God created us. To view man outside of God is to create despair. It produces cynicism, which is half-heartedly contemptuous of man's littleness. It sees man in his meanness. And I don't mean mean in the sense of angry. I mean man mean in the sense of the lowest common denominator. But let us change how we see each other and see ourselves through God's love, through God's righteousness. And all of a sudden, we see God. We see man. We see that there's a reason for sorrow. There's a reason for fail. There's a reason for joy. That there's something noble, something courageous, something we can be devoted to. Here's a few minutes of intermission, and then we'll come back and we'll have the next lesson on James.